Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. We're going to kick off promptly. We've got a lot of content to get through, so big thank you for taking the time out of your busy days to come and join us. Today, we're going to be taking you through the three-keel perspective on the role of business in halting deforestation, and we'll be focusing on the updated AFi Operational Guidelines. Before we get going, I'm just going to cover some housekeeping. We'll start with a presentation that's around 45 minutes, focused on practical applications of the AFI guidelines and what these mean in a real world context. We're keen for this really to be a two-way discussion, so there'll be plenty of opportunities to have your say. We've got 3 different polls we'll be running throughout the session, and then we'll also finish with a Q&A. So I'd encourage you as we go to add your questions to the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your screen. These can be anonymous if you wish. I'll be reviewing them throughout the session before we dive into the Q&A at the end. And just finally, all the information that we'll be presenting to you today is publicly available and may be referenced in any further conversations or discussions that you may have. So some quick introductions of who's going to be presenting today. I'm Róisín Mac Dermott Casement. I'm a senior consultant here at 3Keel within our commodity supply chain business unit. I work across a number of different forest risk commodities and advise several of our retail and FMCG clients on their deforestation-free strategies. I'm delighted to introduce my colleagues who'll be presenting alongside myself today. We have Will Schreiber, who's a founding director at 3Keel. He's a convener for the Retail Soy Group and involved in a number of projects, both with retailers and FMCG companies, focused on halting deforestation in commodity supply chains. We also have Ruth Jenkins, a senior consultant who's currently project managing a number of work streams, again, supporting a number of our clients on deforestation and how to build resilient supply chains. Very briefly, a bit about 3Keel for those of you who may not be familiar with us. Some of you may be very familiar with our work. We're a sustainability consultancy who specialize in supply chains, food systems, and landscapes. We have a fairly unique position when it comes to addressing deforestation and conversion. We have 3 business units that complement each other's work and touch on very different areas, from specialisms in agriculture and land, who focus on better production practices, through to the climate, nature and resources team, who work very closely with corporate businesses on their strategies and sustainability plans. Ruth, Will and myself primarily focus our time within the commodity supply chains team, where, as I've mentioned, we help businesses mitigate deforestation, environmental and human rights risks, improve traceability, and drive sustainability initiatives across their businesses. Very briefly, just to mention, we're really proud of the fact that for 8 consecutive years, we've been recognised as one of the UK's leading management consultancies by the FT. This reflects our ability to drive high impact solutions across our diverse range of clients. And we've also been a B Corp since 2020. Before I hand over to my colleague, Ruth, I'm going to provide you all with a bit of background context on the AFI guidelines to set the scene for our discussion today. As all of you on the webinar today are likely very well aware, there's increasing due diligence requirements in the corporate sustainability space, from the CSDDD to the CSRD and, of course, the EU deforestation regulation, with each of these specifying certain outcomes and requiring their own reporting, risk mitigation actions, and adaptation of internal governance systems within your organizations. In practice, this often necessitates a balancing act between prescriptive adherence to regulatory requirements and use of guardrails for action and adaptation. So bringing us on to the AFI, or the Accountability Framework Initiative. It was created through a consultative process with a wide range of stakeholders, including companies, NGOs, governments, and really provides this consensus view across industry. And it sets out at a high level what best practice looks like and serves as an industry standard guide for companies and others in setting, implementing and monitoring effective commitments on deforestation, ecosystem conversion, and human rights in ethical supply chains. And it's used by companies, financial institutions, governments, and policymakers across the spectrum. So a quick note on the wider AFI structure, of which the operational guidelines are a part. So the operational guidance documents, which we'll be focusing on today, they work to support companies in implementing the AFI's core principles and definitions. And the guidance really serves as a detailed sort of reference on a range of topics for putting these ethical supply chain commitments and policies into practice. In late January, the AFI themselves ran a really comprehensive webinar, which dove into each section in detail. This is actually available on their website for anyone who requires that more in-depth understanding of the guidelines. Our webinar today is not intended as a full comprehensive walkthrough of the guidelines. Rather, we're going to be focusing on those sections that we feel are most relevant to private sector businesses, primarily those who sit in the downstream of the supply chain, retailers, manufacturers, hopefully many of you on the call today. The guidelines really are intended to be comprehensive and extensive, and rather than serving as a rule book, they should be used and interpreted in a specific context for each individual company. So just a refresher on kind of key updates that have happened recently with the AFI. We as 3Keel, through our role in the RSG, supported a working group whose purpose was to update and expand on the published operational guidance on commitments and progress pathways, which was published in December 2025. So quite an extensive process. A lot of different organizations fed into that, and it was eagerly awaited that update in December. The AFI have also stated they will look to publish new guidance on monitoring, reporting, and verification, supply chain management, and traceability throughout H1 and H2 of 2026. And also, just a note that we're delighted to announce that 3Keel are also in the process of becoming an AFI delivery partner. So formalizing our work to date that we've carried out in advising and supporting clients, and perhaps many of you on the call today, in the implementation of the AFI guidelines and principles. So before I hand over to my colleague Ruth, we're going to take a quick pause to hear from those of you on the call today. We're keen to understand what the general level of understanding is of the updated AFI guidelines. And if you just bear with me, I'll pop a poll up on screen. You should be able to see that now. Great, loads of responses trickling in. Okay, many of you first time. A couple of you have read the updates or attended some briefings on the updates. Just leave it a few more minutes, make sure everyone has answered. Okay, great. So a bit of a mixed picture. We've got some people who've read the updates, attended briefings, or looked at the original ones only. And a lot of you, about 50%, it's your first time hearing anything about this. So really helpful as we go into the next section. So I'll now hand over to Ruth to bring us through the first section where we'll talk through an overview of what clarity has been provided in the latest AFI guidance.
Róisín. So given we have quite a variety amongst the audience of understanding, I thought it'd be worth just kind of pulling out some of the key clarifications, and I'll also cover some terminology and also what the AFI guidance looks like if you choose to go and read it a bit further. So the latest guidelines are very much an expansion of the existing framework the AFI had in place. What the updates have done is provide more comprehensive advice where previously there were grey areas or opportunity for different interpretation. They also provide more pragmatic guidance, recognizing the challenges that have become increasingly come to light, given kind of the challenges in trying to close that gap in reaching 100% DCF for many of the companies. And of course, this is particularly challenging for those more complex supply chains. This guidance also goes beyond purely supplier requirements, highlighting 3 clear areas of action. While firstly, of course, you need to ensure what you've purchased is verified, deforestation and conversion free, you also need to ensure that suppliers are responsible and are applying your requirements throughout purchasing. Thirdly, you need to be supporting producers through landscape initiatives. Finally, this guidance goes a lot further than before in providing specific guidance for downstream companies, so many of you on this call. And this is a major source of clarification. It has some really helpful detail on different expectations based on where your company sits within the supply chain. So as 3Keel, we very much welcome this guidance, the increasing kind of clarity that's come from it, and we're already using it in practice with clients who are now thinking beyond 2025 when it comes to policies and commitments. So for those of you who maybe haven't gone into the guidance itself, it's split across 4 chapters and also has a substantial appendix. The first section provides helpful definitions and framing for the following section. It also covers what the AFI state to be features of strong commitments and progress pathways. Section 2, commitments, has detail on how to manage scope and the level of detail that should be applied to those commitments. The third section introduces the concept of progress pathways towards achieving commitments. I'll come on to this in a bit more detail shortly. The fourth section, fulfilling commitments, covers how to continually maintain achievement, so it's not just a one-time thing. My colleague will speak to that in a bit more detail. And crucially, what to do if a company has missed a target. The appendix is definitely not something to be missed, and we'd strongly recommend giving that a read, as there's a lot of really great detail on there which draws out the specifics for the different requirements based on where you sit within the supply chain. I thought it was worth upfront just ensuring clarity on the key concepts and what they mean, as there is some new terminology here, which I've highlighted in orange. Each of these are, of course, relating to the protection of forests and other natural ecosystems, and also crucially human rights, which is a point to highlight. It's heavily incorporated alongside the environmental side of things with these new guidelines. So commitments, these are a public statement a company is making, setting out its intention. Within this, it's both goals and targets. So a goal is a high-level statement of ambition describing an intended future outcome, whereas a target, on the other hand, needs to be more detailed. So they've suggested SMART performance levels, so specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. Progress pathways I've shown on the right here. So these are how you go about meeting the commitments. Progress pathways are basically a sequence of actions and performance improvements through which a company advances towards fulfilling commitments. And this should encompass both action plans and milestones. Action plans are what they say on the tin, so they're documents outlining the actions that a company intends to take to address any issues it might have in fulfilling commitments. Milestones, in orange here because it's a bit of a new concept. So these are time-bound steps towards fulfilling commitments or other obligations. Finally, underpinning the progress pathways is the requirement for ongoing monitoring and reporting of progress being made. So this requirement requires assessment and disclosure. Transparency is a key theme we've seen throughout these guidelines of progress based on performance metrics tied to commitments, milestones, and action plans. What we really wanted to call out here was that we see this introduction of milestones and progress pathways as quite a significant shift. Previously, commitments could have been set and companies' progress against these could have been reported on years after that point, with minimal update between the commitment setting and the planned goal end date. The concept of progress pathways and milestones being introduced recognizes the imperative for more frequent updates and transparency on progress being made, while also providing companies with some flexibility in how they reach these targets and goals. Hopefully that makes sense. You can, of course, find more detail of this in the guidelines itself or speak to us. And before we dive into a bit more detail on clarifications and practical advice that my colleague will cover, we'd be really interested to hear where your company sits within the supply chain so that we can make sure we're drawing out the relevant detail in that section.
Great. Well, we've got a good variety of people who have joined us today. So I'll make sure as I'm going through some of the details that were going to be most relevant for processors and manufacturers and retailers, which are dominating the folks in attendance today, which is great because that's how we tailor the content already. So if you do have any colleagues or friends in other sectors too, everything that you'll be covering that might be relevant for your business might be a little bit different for them, which is completely normal for this type of guidance. So you can see that just in terms of who's here at the moment, we're mostly going to be speaking to the downstream sectors, and that is where we'll kick off. So let's go ahead and move on to the practical implications for the new updates. Beginning with just where it is that you'd be starting in terms of, the points around transparency. So you begin with just, this is the essence of all of the AFI updates, which is it's not necessarily about just saying you're either hitting 100% compliance with your environmental and human rights sourcing strategies. It's more about saying that you've provided real clarity as to what it is you're doing and how it is that you're doing it. And that extends from everything in terms of the scope and boundaries. So what have you decided that you're going to be acting upon? And if you've decided that you're not going to be doing it, it should be based on a double materiality assessment. So it's not enough just to say it's difficult or that market isn't really interested in this topic and therefore we're not getting into it. It's more that you've done a proper review to say where are the environmental or financial kind of dependencies that you have in your value chain in terms of prioritizing your areas of engagement, and that based upon that risk-based approach and risk assessment, you're developing specific targeted strategies to mitigate them. If you then are going to exclude, or if you're going to be taking different approaches, you need to provide that explanation stating how it is that you came to those conclusions, not just having blanket statements like, for our fresh supply chain, we're taking this action, and not saying anything about, long life, as the case may be. Similarly, when you're moving beyond kind of scope and boundaries and you're looking at other elements of your work, you'll need to be looking at the assessment and kind of management and governance framework. So explaining how it is that you're actually managing your commitments, what risk-based systems you're going to be using within your organization to actively monitor and see if any of those initial assessments are still valid. If you've got procurement controls in place, which would be expected under good management practices, do you describe that they exist, what they are? Is it a suspend and engage approach, or is it an engage and then suspend if they don't take action? Those types of details are really helpful for others, including your shareholders or customers, to understand what and how it is that you're taking action in each of these areas. Similarly, when you look at a monitoring, reporting, and verification system, you should be reporting actively in terms of how it is that you're engaging and delivering change, or at least delivering your commitments and policy ambitions. So provide explanations wherever you've had successes or failures or gaps that you're still trying to do. Talk about how it is that you can have confidence that the information that you're disclosing is actually accurate. Is it something that you've just done from internal assessments? Is it something that you've worked with a third party on? Do you have a verification system that's, whether it's assurance or some other mechanism that you're using, that it's not just based upon voluntary disclosures, but that there's a degree of further assessment that's actually taking place? So those performance KPIs shouldn't just be numbers, but explanations for why and how each of these things are progressing. And where you are falling short or not falling short at all, but just are making progress as expected, that transparency of your action plan should be present. Have time-based approaches, say what your anticipated milestones are. If you reach that milestone and you haven't hit it, you'll need to update your action plan to say, okay, we didn't do that last year. This is what we're planning on doing. Why didn't we hit it? Where are we going from here? Because that changing of course means that it shouldn't just be that you set an ambition for 2030 and you don't say anything about it until 2030, or you just have a number that says like, well, we were working on 0%, now we're at 25%, 50%, 75%, 100%. If those are your milestones, state so. But they don't have to be that way. You don't have to have a linear approach. It could be that you've got incremental steps that you're looking at building up to that broader view. But the underlying expectation that comes out from these types of clarifications is just that you need to have a plan, explain what it is with specific elements, and then just disclose how it's going and be open to course corrections if it's not going the way that you were expecting because of new things coming up. The second implication, I think, of the updates of the guidelines is that you'll probably be expecting that you could have different roles, but as Ruth indicated, there's some good examples with the appendix to the guidelines that provide some real case studies, examples, well, not really case studies, real examples about how it is that you would apply these principles in practice. But the reality is that for some of your organizations, you might be having multiple hats. It could be that for some elements of your value chain, you've got a real integrated approach. So perhaps you've got farms as well as retail operations for that, in which case the degree of risk and control that you have to manage can be a bit different. So we've characterized these principally in kind of three different buckets that you can look at. This isn't AFI's characterization. This is our interpretation of it, which is, first of all, if you're ever buying any at-risk commodity, you don't really have an excuse for excluding a non-compliance where you have it in your value chain. You should always be saying this is what you're doing and this is how you're engaging producers on either reintegration or whatever management system that you have, where there's something that may be occurring that's inconsistent with what your policy ambitions are or your commitments. So typically, if you were a producer yourself, there's no excuse for not, and you were working towards AFI guidelines, there's no excuse for not doing that. This is how we're delivering against this ambition, and you'd still have your action plan for it. But you would be expected to say that, at least if you were aligned to it, that you were delivering against that. And it's the same thing if you're the first buyer of some of those materials. So if you're directly contracted to a farm or a farming group, you might be expected to say that if you find that there's a nonconformance, there's an immediate action that you're taking. This is different as you move further up the supply chain, because once you get to, that you're a manufacturer or a brand, perhaps you're in finance or an investor, or even in some cases of retail where you have these operations, your visibility and your ability to influence those people on the ground starts to be a bit more diffused. And where that's taking place, you need to interpret and have action plans that are reflective of that diminishing element of control that you have over the specific materials that are entering in your supply chain. And the guidelines help provide that type of clarity and expectations for you in terms of how it is that you might be able to phase some of your implementation plans accordingly. And as you get further downstream, such as with retailers, which many of you on today are, it's keeping in mind that that type of expectation might be completely different. And there might be elements of your supply chain that are so complex that you're never actually going to be able to get the degree of visibility that you would like to be able to say that you have 100% alignment with your procurement policy, but that doesn't excuse you from not taking any actions on it. It's just saying your actions might be a little bit different from somebody who's actually saying, I know that farm, I've got the coordinates that I can monitor, I know the workers that are there for my own audits for it, I can identify those nonconformances and develop specific action plans for those particular actors. Downstream, it might be you still have supply chain actions that are particular to an individual supplier that you're sourcing from, but what those actions are might be very different from if you were a farmer themselves. So moving on to the kind of next view in terms of how it is that you would take some of these multiple roles and expectations and drive them forward within your own supply chain, we get to the next topic whenever the screen here actually goes into, which is about prioritizing those actions. So first of all, it doesn't matter where you're sitting. It's going to be expected that you're taking some sort of action everywhere. And there are certain things that you simply can't say they're out of scope. So you can't say your destination markets. So this is going to be saying like the European market really cares about this, but X, Y, or Z market, our customers aren't interested in all, therefore we're not really taking a commitment or an action in that area. everything that your organization procures, regardless of that customer demand, is supposed to be covered by your procurement policies. And similarly, as I said, that kind of no excuse bucket, if you're directly involved in producing or doing primary processing of the material, you really can't exclude something saying that it's a difficult supply chain or it's a difficult supplier to engage with because you are making that decision as to who it is that you're sourcing from, or you're controlling that production landscape yourself. But when it comes to which geography you're prioritizing for specific actions or engagement, that might be different depending upon your proximity or the risk associated with it. Similarly, with commodities, there might be some highly developed supply chains right now where it's completely possible to have a higher degree of engagement as well as interventions or monitoring than in others. If we're looking at something like the palm oil supply chain into Europe, it is pretty developed, and you can have a fairly high degree of traceability, even all the way back to plantation. Whereas if you're looking at something like rubber for cocoa, you get some nexus points where there's visibility on one stage, but then it gets really lost before it gets to the downstream market. And therefore, how it is that you would engage and how you'd phase activities for that type of commodity might be a different scenario from what it is that you're doing with palm oil. Similarly, you might have different types of suppliers. Some of your suppliers might be marketing agents. So they don't actually have any manufacturing facilities themselves. They're just buying things on the market and moving them from one company to another. Or it could be somebody who's just manufacturing a ready meal product, but isn't actually involved in rearing a chicken or sourcing, the dairy products that are going into it from the specific farmers. Whereas a dairy manufacturer might know the farmers, but they won't actually know where the feed is coming from. So these types of supplier types come into play in that you can still phase how your activities are for engaging them based upon a segmentation that you might be using. It doesn't mean that you don't do anything in those complex supply chains. It's just saying that you might be doing slightly different things with one group of suppliers than another, and you just explain why it is that you're doing that and what the plan is for that difficult type. So those tables don't need to be aligned between everybody, but they should be present and they should be explained. And those justifications are really what makes it a credible view as to what your organization is actually doing for delivering. But the main flag that we just want to have too on this is that when you do that sequencing, it needs to be based on risk rather than complexity itself. So just because it's complex doesn't mean that you have an excuse for inaction. It's just the phasing of requirements that might be different with it. So any sequencing of actions should be looked at to saying this is a degree of area that you have uncertainty on, or some other degree of action that you're looking to take place. So some more details on what phasing might look like. I can't say it enough, no delays. Do something everywhere. It's just be mindful that something might be a little bit different. So where you're doing this, be clear about what is different about each phase and supply chain that's requiring a different roadmap to be delivered, why it is that you're using multiple pathways, how it is that you're looking at delivering that in practice, and when it is that you're looking for various milestones to be achieved. So if we were looking at my favorite material, soy, you would see that there's different types here. So you've got some that might be soybeans. So you're buying soybeans directly. You might be sourcing it from producers, you might be sourcing it from a marketing agent, whatever it is, you might say, our goal here is to say that all of the soybeans that we buy, unprocessed, going into edamame, et cetera, for that, are going to be deforestation and conversion free. In which case, for 2026, you might say everything that we buy directly is going to be deforestation conversion free, but we can't do that with all of our indirect supply chain right now. So that's not coming from the soy producers that you contract with. It's going to be coming through some other third party, a trading agent for some reason. It might be spot market purchases. There could be a number of different reasons why you don't have direct visibility for it, but your plan is to deal with that over the next year. And therefore, by 2027, you might have a fully deforestation and conversion-free supply chain. Whereas with oils, it's a more complex supply chain because you have different inputs and outputs and mass balancing that's generally occurring at multiple stages of the supply chain. And therefore, you've described the issue. It's complex, and there's a high degree of mixing. And you're going to move through a process, perhaps that's getting from some sort of mass balance certification to the point where you're going to be deforestation conversion free. But even in a few years, there might just always be this problem where there's a degree of mass balance that has to take place. And if that's part of your roadmap, you have to say this is why and explain what the difficulties are and what you're going to do about it and why mass balance certification may still play a role for you in trying to manage some of the risk, but it should be alongside some other activity that's taking place. Whereas if we look at soy and feed, it's an entirely indirect impact for many companies that we work with. And those sourcing decisions are made by people that might be 3 or 4 tiers away from you entirely, in which case you might have a roadmap that's looking at risk engagement and activity to try to make the feed sector more deforestation and conversion free. But the main lever that you might be able to pull as an organization could be in the producer support side of things, which you can start immediately, in which case your roadmap might be, we make DCF requirements for our suppliers and our feeds to, indirect supplier and feed to deliver against. However, as an organization, our biggest lever for change is going to be transforming the production landscape. So here's how we're going to transform the production landscape. We're going to identify who the feed manufacturers are. We're going to work with them on transforming their own supply chain. We're going to do risk management approaches that are going to be in place as well. And we're also going to try to find those priority sourcing areas so we can make sure that we're affecting change on the ground too. These are all descriptions of activities that can take place. And in the 3 different buckets that Ruth described earlier, DCF supply, responsible suppliers, production, support, you'll want to make sure that you're moving on each of them. It's just explaining why you might be having more efforts earlier in some areas than in others. So phasing is allowed. It is just something that you have to explain and you have to be really clear about, and it has to be reflective of risk. When we look at scope, you shouldn't really be excluding materials from scope just because they're low value or low volume. It needs to be based upon some sort of social or environmental risk as well. You could be that because you're going to be using some type of supplier engagement on that front, but you need to make sure that you're incorporating in some other information just beyond, we've looked at our finances, it's not very high. We've looked at the risk of cocoa overall. We don't think that it's very high for us in this particular area. Therefore, we're not going to engage on cocoa. The reason for this is because you do need to engage and understand what's taking place. You might have 90% of an entire commodity system that's addressed all of these issues, but how do you know that the 10% isn't 100% of what's coming into your supply chain? So you have to do some type of view of a risk assessment to make sure that you're at that point where you've got negligible environmental or social risks if you're going to say something isn't going to be in the direct scope of your activities. And you should be able to describe that with credible public evidence and do regular monitoring to see if that situation is actually changing. So be specific in what the exclusion may be, where it's present, but you really shouldn't have exclusions. And when you're doing due diligence, that might still be required, even if you think that it's not relevant for an overarching risk assessment. You might be in a regulated market where even just 1 ton of material, 1 kilogram of material is still regulated by something like the EUDR that you're responsible for. So you need to make sure that you're taking this holistic view of all that potential risk. And if you've excluded something from scope right now because it's very difficult, because you're doing that ongoing monitoring and review, you should be able to expand scope over time because perhaps there's other areas that you're working on to address any of the latent risks that might be present for those particular materials. So view this as not a one-off achievement. When you set these targets, it's really about having an active management system in place. So you set out what your plan is, and that plan should be about reaching a steady state of compliance with it. So some organizations will have set 100% DCF targets for 2025. Some of them may have achieved them, many didn't, and we'll talk about that more, about missed commitments. But the point about the AFI guidelines is making sure that this is a matter of course for your business, that you constantly are looking at the risk and you're managing that risk. And then once you've achieved the implementation of your systems for managing it, they need to be maintained. So you have to have purchasing controls that are really going to be put in place because that's what prevents some of these non-compliances from occurring. That means you have to be doing new supplier screens. Maybe it's some sort of annual review and assurance and audit process that you might already be doing with your suppliers to make sure that if there's changes that are occurring, they used to be sourcing from X, now they're sourcing from Y. Suddenly we had them as a nice green cap. Now we need to review the new sourcing decisions that are taking place. Certainly with how things have gone in the commodities market over the past few years, their sourcing is very dynamic. in a lot of these soft commodity spaces, from geopolitics to environmental situations driving real supply chain constraints. This is a really flexible spot at the moment. So those purchasing controls should be that even when that's occurring, there's some degree of indication that you have to ensure that you've got notice of what's taking place and the ability to stop a non-compliant purchase from occurring where it's taking place. But even where it occurs, you're going to be having those, realistic non-conformances, and those gaps or those, flukes that are out there. You need to make sure that you're getting that captured within your reporting system and that you're addressing them, because that goes to how it is that your plan might evolve in light of those types of situations as they occur. So when we talk about episodic non-compliance, this is something that comes up every once in a while on this. It's saying that this is likely. You're going to have spot market purchases that are going to be there. Achieving 100% and considering yourself a failure if you get to 99.9% isn't helpful for anybody. Instead, it's just saying, look, where they occur, you see them as a non-conformance, and there's an action that you're taking to address it going forward. So think about it this way. It's not just a one-off target that everybody gets a bonus for when they achieve it. It's something that's really active within your organization. So if you miss a target, as I was saying, AFI came out last May with some guidelines to say, look, we know not everybody's going to achieve 100% DCF for this year, despite their SBTI flag commitments, despite what they might have set out back in 2020 or their voluntary kind of ambitions within this area. What is it that you do? And this has now been codified more in the guidelines that have come out too. So the first of all is that you shouldn't be changing your commitments or time-bound targets. If you said that everybody in your supply chain needed to comply by the end of 2025, that's what your company commitment is. So if people aren't doing that, then your action plan is how is it that you're going to be addressing those gaps, rather than saying, well, we set the target for 2025, we're not DCF now, so now we're going to be DCF in 2030. That's not advised by the AFI on that. It's saying you keep 2025, you have a plan for delivery as quickly as possible, where those gaps are still present. So when you're going to be missing them, whether it's now or later in 2026, 2027, make sure that you're communicating the specific reasons and you're qualifying why it is that target or milestone has been missed, how it is that you might be strengthening your monitoring to make sure that you've got the mechanisms in place to prevent future non-conformances, update your action plans, and continue to keep the public informed. The public is your shareholders, its stakeholders, its civil society, its customers, and you should just be saying, this is how we're doing in this area and being honest about that. Now, the biggest question that everybody has off of these two is, this is really robust. And that's the point. This is saying this is a best practice view of what you should be doing as an organization. And these are called guidelines. The AFI is not a procurement standard. It is not a standard in itself. They are guidelines. They're called operational guidelines. That means they're more or less recommendations. So when you say that you're aligned with the accountability framework, it's saying that you're taking best practice and you're aligning to them. In your specific context, within your value chain, within your organization, they may not always be realistic for what you should be expecting to do. So the first is going to be the breadth of application. Within the guidelines, it says that it's basically not just forest risk commodities that you should be looking at, it's all commodities. So you might have soft fruits that might be not in the primary view of what's considered a forest risk commodity, but perhaps there's deforestation or conversion or human rights issues that are occurring within some of those production landscapes. In which case, AFI would say they should be included within your approach here, because it should be for everything, not just the major 7, top 10 primary drivers of deforestation that we know about within the world. That may not be relevant for all of your organizations in terms of how it is that you can choose to apply that in practice. And you might be sourcing, especially as a retailer, literally everything that's out there, and having that type of information and flooding the zone with it isn't going to be conducive to actually explaining what it is you're doing and having to justify every exclusion, having phases for all of these different areas. It's an ideal. It's not always workable in practice. You should be aligned at least for those primary forest risk commodities. The second one is that you have to decide what your political capital is that you're expending with suppliers on engaging on each of these matters too. So if you're addressing palm oil, if you're addressing cocoa, you might have 1,000 different requests that are coming to them between climate obligations, water risk, deforestation, social ambitions. All of that's coming together, and you might have to be picky choosy as to what it is that you're developing action plans with them on that you're really holding them to account on. Because with many suppliers, it might only be that your action plan is going to be covering 3, 5 different areas that are really of concern for your organization for them to really prioritize and act upon. And you might have a long list of lots of other things that you would like them to do. If you're picking those 3 to 5, you have to decide what is it that's the most relevant for your organization across the whole gambit of environmental and social responsible sourcing that you're undertaking right now. How many asks, how frequently are they coming? What data points are you asking for them? What leverage points do you have? You're going to be expending it. And if you push them all on data, where actually what you need them to have is more of a procurement system in place and just monitoring that procurement system, that's a decision that you get to make in terms of how it is that you choose to deploy your action plan and prioritize each of those individual areas. The next one that's up here is going to be around having de minimis thresholds. So you might decide that you actually want to have thresholds for your organization because perhaps you're only sourcing 1 kilogram of material, and it might be pervasive across lots of different products, but in micro elements for it. And therefore having some sort of de minimis threshold can focus you and your organization on where it is that you would like to be, targeting all of your efforts. The next one's that some of you may not have any deforestation or, soft commodity policies or strategies in place right now. You didn't have a 2025 commitment. That's fine. And AFI tries to recognize this by having clarity of not having specific dates within the guidelines by saying 2025 is the absolute cutoff date. It talks about having target dates and cutoff dates, and that your target date should be after a cutoff date and those types of elements with it. But because you're a late start, you might actually have a higher degree of ambition. It wouldn't just be picking up some company strategy from 5 years ago to say, well, that's how company A did it, and therefore that's the same playbook that we're going to run now, because the entire sector has moved on phenomenally over that period into the degrees of action and expectations and data availability and traceability systems on this, which means that you can actually have a late mover advantage in terms of the ambition that's coming forward. So you might phase some of this too in terms of just being a late starter. It could mean that you've got less ambition in some areas than others, and it could mean that you have more ambition than others just between where you are and where they were. And finally, the last little bit up here is just thinking about that leverage point, so that when you are engaging suppliers, it's not going to be something that you're a teeny tiny customer for them and you're spending an outsized amount of effort on a company that's frankly just not going to shift. So you might be able to shift suppliers, but you might not be. Perhaps they're the only supplier of a specific material that you need for your organization. So one thing that we think is really helpful is where you take the AFI guidelines and you try to work with peers in your sector to interpret and apply what a model policy or approach might look like. So we represent the Retail Soy Group, and we've been working with retailers to try to define what a best practice model policy might look like considering the AFI guidelines. Now, all those decisions around thresholds and everything are elements that we had to talk about in trying to look at where it is that we might be differentiating different requirements for different types of value chains, and having the evidence base to say this is why we're setting a threshold of X, Y, or Z, why we might approach strategic suppliers differently from small suppliers, why manufacturers and supply chains might be different from livestock producers, why somebody who's directly buying soy in their value chain might have other expectations from transparency to compliance and delivery of DCF than others, while still saying everybody in the supply chain, regardless of size, is expected to have a deforestation policy. We then break things down even further by having preference-based sourcing that says there's our priorities and ways of working. And when it comes to reporting structures, AFI, again, would say that you need something that's consistent and comparable. Well, as a sector, that gives you the opportunity for saying, well, here's the different types of compliance routes or descriptions that we're looking at for those types of indicators. And that way, when you're comparing retailer A to retailer B, civil society and customers and shareholders and investors have the ability for comparing like for like within that rather than it just being open to the world. So AFI encourages these types of disclosures and alignment within a sector to occur so that interpretation becomes more relevant. If you're looking at individual companies, we took an example from Danone's updated forest policy that they just released to the public last December, where it's a great example of how descriptive you can be in terms of describing a doubled materiality assessment that's taken place to identify the key materials that are included within their forest policy, what their governance processes are, so whose accountability for it, what are the delivery plans that are underway in order to achieve those ambitions, as well as taking segmented approaches around both transparency and the different mechanisms that are going to be in there. So it's a real example of why they typically get A ratings from CDP in terms of how it is that they manage their forest risk. So that brings us to just where it is that we go next beyond 2030. And there's a few things that we just have for recommendations, which is, first of all, I can't say it enough. Consider this a template. It's a best practice guideline. Use it as a reference point. It's not a rule book. Don't throw the whole thing out just because you find some elements might be a bit tricky for your organization to deal with or your sector to deal with. Find a way to make it work for you. Pull out the information that is going to be most helpful in setting out those targets and ambitions and those action plans. The second one is that when you look at your due diligence system and your approaches, they're going to align really well with the guidelines. Now, with due diligence, it's about reducing risk to a negligible level, which is the same ambition of AFI. AFI provides a bit of the bridge for what does that actually mean and how do you manage that in practice. But while they might be more detailed than a lot of the regulatory frequently asked questions and guidelines that are coming out from Europe and perhaps other emerging territories that are setting out these types of legislation, the legislation requirements will always take precedence. And if EUDR says it is deforestation free and monitored and you're giving us polygons for it, that is the approach that you have to use. So none of this is a replacement for what might be vague due diligence expectations, but the systemic elements that you would need for control is very well aligned with implementing the AFI program as a whole. The next one is going to be looking at your strategic alignment. So you all probably have different policies for different issues. And we know that many of them don't even reference each other, and they might be housed by different parts of your business. So you could have environment, and environment could be split between two different teams, somebody who's dealing with climate and somebody who's dealing with forests. And then you've got human rights and indigenous rights, which might be just with some sort of quality team that's focused on compliance because you get more legality around those types of issues. And you might have a quality team that's just saying that you want to make sure that your qualities of their products is what you're expecting and paying for. But all of these things should be complementary with one another and reference, particularly when you're looking at that supplier leverage point that you're using and kind of that political capital that you have for engaging with them. You need to know that you've got one approach which is consistent in terms of what those priorities are for the supplier and how it is that you're actually engaging them on each of those points. And I think finally, our recommendation is really just about understanding your role and then really driving change with the levers that you have to pull. So there will be different points in the value chain that will have different opportunities. There will be challenges that will be unique to you, either as a business or as a sector. Figure it out and then say, we understand that, but here's how we're going to be making sure that we're ultimately trying to deliver a more environmentally and socially responsible commodity system for the world. Because without that, many of the challenges that we face aren't actually going to be delivered. So with that, in terms of my kind of key recommendations and kind of views from the 3Kill side of things, I'll just be handing back over to Róisín, who will take us through the final little bits before we open up to the Q&A.
Thanks, Will. So just to make sure everyone's still awake on the session here, we thought we'd have one final audience question around how you're currently thinking after all of that great insight that's been provided on some next steps you might take to align with the updated guidance. So one more poll coming your way. Great to see the responses coming in already. I think fairly consistent picture, review of policies and processes required. 1, no idea. And 1, nothing much to do. Currently confident we're aligned. Great. I think the majority of people on the call today sitting within that bucket of review of policies and processes required. Just give you a minute or 2 to answer that. Then we'll move on. Great. So before we move into the Q&A, just a quick reminder, as we mentioned at the offset, there's more AFI guidelines coming down the track in H1 2026 and H2. So to keep an eye out for those. And aware we went through a lot of content today on the call, and hopefully it was relevant and interesting to the ongoing work that you're doing in your businesses. So please do feel free to reach out to us following this webinar if you feel you could benefit from some more specific engagement and support. We're experts specifically within our team across roadmaps and strategy, supply chain, MRV and reporting, and also work throughout sort of our coalition and collaborative approaches such as the RSG. So hopefully, if anything today was of interest to you, do feel free to reach out to us and we could take that forward with you and your business. A quick reminder that the recording from today's session is going to be uploaded to our website, and we'll also share it with all attendees afterwards via email, so you can share more widely with your colleagues or peers who might be interested. We've also got a series of other 3Keel webinars in the pipeline as well, from everything from landscape investments to the implications of the land sector removals guidance document. We did a webinar earlier in the year on the updated land sector and removals document that came out as well. So yeah, a lot to dive into there. They're all on our website, so please do reach out if any of those are of interest to you. Want to leave time now for the Q&A. And thank you to those who have submitted a couple of questions as we went along. There's a lot, as we said, to dive into on this, and we'll try and get to your questions. If we don't get to them all today, we'll follow up with you. Taking a look in the Q&A box here, I think first question for Will, very specific example here, I think, and pulls out nicely perhaps some of the challenges that you discussed in your presentation, Will. One of the attendees is asking, cocoa is less than 0.1% of our feedstock volumes, but we're heavily criticized by investors for not explicitly including it in our policies. The volumes are SG certified and DCF verified as such. Is it acceptable to not have a DCF roadmap for such a commodity and rather to rely on just certification?
So it's a great question, because this gets down to that double materiality assessment and doing it based on risk rather than just on volumes. So the 0.1% is very much a volume-based kind of degree of exposure, whereas the material itself might have high. Now you're saying that, or the person who posed the question says that what they're buying is already segregated and certified and therefore DCF already, in which case you've already tackled the most challenging aspect for it. So when we talk about double materiality, it's just saying don't just use that volume or financial view as to what might be important for your business. You have to incorporate in the material risk of nonconformance with your DCF policy. And I would always say that if you've got some sort of iconic material that's expected, you should have it in there and you should have a plan for what it is that you're doing about it. But whether or not everybody can achieve 100% segregated sources, I mean, I applaud you for doing that. That's very challenging for many downstream companies to do because of the way that cocoa is generally processed within that sector before it gets to an end customer.
Great, thank you, Will. We've had a couple of questions come in around missed targets. So I've just been looking through and trying to summarize, I guess, the common theme that's coming through here, and maybe this one for Ruth. So if a company publicly discloses that it's missed a milestone for whatever reason, how does the AFI suggest they sort of balance this transparency with the potential risk of criticism that might come through internally or externally?
Yeah, really good question. And I think hopefully one of the key themes that everyone on this webinar will take away is just the importance of transparency. So yeah, the AFI guidelines suggest that yeah, you need to clearly communicate the reasons why a milestone or target might have been missed. So was it due to unforeseen circumstances, technical barriers, etc.? Then importantly, kind of that action plan piece. So publishing what you're going to do about falling short. And then they do suggest retaining those original targets publicly, and not just kind of quietly erase them from public view on websites, etc. And then just make sure what you're doing all you can to be strengthening, monitoring and reporting, and keeping everyone in the loop. So yeah, the primary takeaway I would say is transparency, and that should hopefully mitigate criticism.
Thanks, Ruth. Just taking a look through here, maybe another one for Will. Looking specifically around sort of alignment with regulatory requirements. So where the AFI guidelines are more detailed than regulatory FAQs, can they be used as evidence of being an effective due diligence process if challenged by a supervisory authority?
I mean, implementing the guidelines is one part of it. I think that your part of the guidelines would be that your whole MRV system should be reviewed, and maintained in that, and that your goal is to get to negligible risk. So where you're looking at regulatory requirements, they will also use the language of reduced to a negligible risk. So if your system is actually robust enough in delivering against that and you have an occasional non-compliance, you need to distinguish between what might happen with like your product being stopped at a port from coming in because a non-conformance has occurred, versus some sort of prosecution for negligence and not following the legislation. So what I would generally approach with the AFI guidelines for is it's showing this is how you should manage it. But if you're trying to say we've just implemented the AFI system, we're fine, we don't have to do anything else, that's not really the spirit of what the guidelines are. The guidelines are about having active management to a negligible level, and it provides some of the details of how it is that you'd be working towards it. But wherever there's a regulatory requirement, you do need to keep in mind that those are more absolute. It is either compliant or it's not compliant. And some of the phasing, it's not going to work to say, well, that was a complex supply chain. So, that beef or, currently leather for us is something that we're not dealing with for 2 or 3 years because we're just working on engagement right now. If EUDR is enforced at the end of this year and leather is something that's applicable to your organization, that's something that needs to be compliant on day one. So do look at it as a complementary kind of element of what your due diligence system is, and a real kind of guidepost for what you should be putting into place within the organization. But you wouldn't be able to just say we're AFI aligned and therefore regulators go away. What it does do is if you truly implement the guidelines as they're intended around here, if there was some sort of prosecution, that you would be going into your evidence base for saying we have actively managed this and we are actively managing it, and it would go to an argument then that there might have just been an unusual occurrence, but you had done everything in your power to negate the risk that might be present. But it's not a compliance standard. It's a management approach and operational guideline for how it is that you deliver against it.
Great, thank you, Will. I think we might have time for just one more question. Appreciate we may not have gotten around to all of your questions in the Q&A. Great to see so much engagement, but we will follow up with you afterwards if we haven't gotten to your question. So final one, perhaps, for Will as well, on sort of that risk versus complexity point. How would you recommend a company handle a scenario where the highest risk supply chain is also the most complex and data poor, and therefore it's the most difficult to sort of move quickly and agilely?
Yeah, this is the case for something like soy for retailers, where it's a high volume, highly complex supply chain, very limited direct interventions are possible for a retailer. I think that's segmentation and phasing. So it's explaining, one, this is what the problem is, but then two, having a plan against it. And certainly, for members in the Retail Soy Group, some of those plans are now coming together in terms of, the development of a new British standard that'll have deforestation and conversion free, something that can be specified as a way of moving towards that type of alignment. So for the next year, until such a standard comes out, it's going to be the engagement side of things, with that engagement with the feed sector on how that transition can take place. Whereas from year 2, year 3, maybe you'll be able to specify that standard, and that will then take time to actually implement within the value chain until the materials are available. And then you might have increasing elements for that. So I'm using that as an example of, it is high risk, it is complex, but there are things that you can do today when you know the reasons for that complexity and you try to come up for solutions to it that you can demonstrate that you're taking action on it in moving forward. So yeah, great question, as always.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Will and Ruth. We're bang on 2 o'clock, so we'll wrap up there. And just a big thank you to everyone for coming along and attending. As I mentioned, the recording will be shared with you afterwards and the slides. And if anything has sparked your interest from this session and you feel like you could benefit from some support from 3Keel, please do reach out to us. We'd be delighted to have a chat with you and pick it up following this conversation, which was great. Lots of rich insights. So yeah, thanks so much, everybody, and have a great rest of your week.